Trump's Iran war left the Gulf state shattered. U.S. bases turned into targets, economies battered, and the oasis myth destroyed. Gulf rulers now confront a harsh reckoning over their reliance on Washington and the uncertain search for a new fragile security order. As Trump assembled major U.S. naval and air assets in the eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and others quietly urged Washington to avoid a full-scale assault on Iran, fearing a direct blowback to their territory and energy infrastructure. Nevertheless, the United States Air and Israel Air Campaign began on February 28, 2026, without a clearly defined and publicly articulated political endgame beyond crippling Iran's capabilities. This disconnect between military escalation and strategic purpose now lies at the core of Gulf leaders' anger and sense of betrayal toward Washington. Trump's strategic manipulations. Trump's decision to launch joint U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran has produced far higher strategic costs than his administrations appear to have anticipated, from energy shocks and disrupted shipping to heightened regional fragmentation and anti-American sentiment. Even if Iranian capabilities are significantly degraded, the war has exposed vulnerabilities in U.S. power projection, unsettled allies, and invited greater Russian and Chinese diplomatic activism in the Gulf. The long-term price for Washington will be measured less in battlefield metrics than in diminished trust and leverage among its traditional Arab partners. U.S. bases turned to liabilities. From a Gulf perspective, U.S. bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE were meant to deter Iran and guarantee regime security. Instead, they became priority target once the war began. Iran explicitly framed its strike on these facilities as retaliation against Washington, but their location in densely populated and economically vital areas meant that nearby civilian infrastructure also suffered severe damage. This exercise is reinforcing a view in Gulf capitals that foreign basing arrangements draw fire without delivering the reliable protection they assumed for decades. A nightmare realized. Gulf leaders long warned that a war with Iran would shatter their security and economics, a nightmare that has now materialized as Iranian missiles and drones hit oil facilities, ports, power plants, and cities across the region. They blame Washington for launching the campaign and Israel for pressing to neutralize Iran regardless of collateral damage in neighboring Arab states. The sense in Gulf capital is that their caution was dismissed, while they have paid a disproportionate price in physical destruction, economic setback, disrupted export, and heightened domestic anxiety. Shattered oasis narrative. The image of Gulf hubs like Dubai, Doha, and Riyadh as insulated oases open to business, tourism, and investment has been badly damaged by missiles alert, strikes on ports and airports, and the closure of key sea lanes. Restoring Confidence will require visible reconstruction, enhanced civil defense, improved air and missile defenses, and credible diplomacy that lower the perceived risk of another sudden war. Investors and tourists will demand proof that the region can manage Iran-related tension, not just high-end events and mega projects. Trump misreading of Iranian escalation. Trump publicly argued that overwhelming force would quickly coerce Iran and usher in regime change, while keeping fighting over there, yet he appears not to have anticipated the breadth of Iranian retaliation against neighboring Gulf state or a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC's effective shutdown of the strait, including attacks and threats against commercial shipping, has produced global energy shocks and exposed the fragility of U.S. planning assumptions. For Gulf leaders, this underscores how inadequate Washington's war planning was, and in accounting for second and third order consequences. Calculated decision not to retaliate. Despite heavy damage, Gulf rulers have so far avoided direct retaliation against Iran, calculating that further escalation would expose their cities and infrastructure to even more punishing strikes. Publicly, they stressed restraint and international law, but privately, officials acknowledge their enduring geographic reality. They must coexist with a powerful and a proximate Iran long after this U.S.-led campaign ends. By holding their fire, they hope to preserve space for post-war de-escalation and avoid being locked into a permanent state of open conflict. Recasting security arrangement with Washington. Given their limited strategic alternatives, Gulf monarchies are unlikely to sever ties with Washington, but will seek more conditional, transactional security arrangements. They are pressing for a clearer U.S. commitment on defense of their territory, better integration of regional missile defenses, and greater say over decisions that could trigger Iranian retaliation. At the same time, they will hedge by deepening ties with China, Russia, Europe, and Asia energy importers, thereby reducing exclusive reliance on the United States while keeping the American security umbrella in place. Gulf option to prevent future conflagration. To prevent a repeat, Gulf states are also exploring limited de-escalation channels with Tehran, tighter regional crisis hotlines, and revived maritime security arrangement that includes non-Western actors such as China and India. They may push for new rules of engagement around energy infrastructure and shipping lanes, seeking informal understandings that keep these off limits even in crisis. Internally, they are reassessing missile defense, hardening critical facilities, and considering more diversified export routes that reduce dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. None of these options are fully reassuring, but together they offer partial risk reduction. Prospect for normalization with Iran. Speculation about full normalization, including a non-belligerency pact between Iran, Gulf state, builds on pre-war trends of caution, dialogue, and economic engagement. Whether this is truly in the cards depends on war outcomes. Iran's internal politics and Gulf threat perception. If the Iran regime survives but remains hostile, Gulf states will likely revert to hedging, combining deterrence, limited engagement, and outreach to outside powers. A more pragmatic Iranian leadership could make structured security arrangements and phase confidence-building measures more plausible over time. No return to the status quo ante. The Gulf states will not return to the pre-war status quo. Instead, they are likely to pursue a more diversified security architecture, combining a thinner U.S. shield with expanded ties to China, Russia, and Asian importers. This shift will gradually dilute Washington's centrality in Gulf security, complicating U.S. forces' departure and Israel's assumption of autocratic Arab backing against Iran. For Israel, a more cautious, risk-averse Gulf may limit overt strategic alignment, while for the United States, enduring mistrust will make coalition building for a future crisis far more difficult. Trump's Iran adventure is not an isolated blunder, but the latest and perhaps most explosive expression of his assault on an already fragile global order. By disregarding restraint, sidelining allies, and weaponizing American power for short-term political gain, he has accelerated the erosion of U.S. credibility, fractured Western alliances, and opened a new strategic space for Russia and China. The Gulf states are simply the newest casualties of this disorder. Their cities struck, economies shaken, and security assumptions shattered. Whatever emerges from this war, it will be a restored status quo, but a more fragmented, volatile Middle East in which Israel and the United States confront a diminishing margin of error and a far, far narrower circle of willing, trusting partners.